Welcome, everybody. This is Denny with Why Is This True? And joining me today is James Oroc from the Dominican Republic. And James wrote a fantastic book that I read a few years ago called The Tryptamine Palace. And so he's joining me today on Skype, and we're going to go through some stuff. And so thank you so much, James, for joining me. This is something I wanted to do for a long time.
Oh, my pleasure. Good timing since I got a new book out too.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. So I decided to hit the record button right away because we were getting into some really good stuff that James was telling me about Narby's book, where Narby's kind of left off. James picked up. So we were talking about the ancient forms of ayahuasca in the form of snuff. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, we started from discussing the fact that my house is in the Dominican Republic. It was probably the first place that the Spanish ran into psychedelic use, entheogen use amongst the New World residents, since the Taino Indians from here commonly used DMT-containing snuffs. And then they spread down through Colombia and Venezuela, but it seems like the Hispaniola may well have been their homeland. But the snuff use is fascinating because it goes back thousands of years. They found psychedelic snuffs in graves in Chile that date back 3,700 years at least, I think, and we think snuff use goes back way beyond that. And it solves one of the mysteries of ayahuasca. Like when I started to really study about ayahuasca, I was like, the first thing that fascinated me was how could they come up with this very complex combination with the enormous search space of the Amazon jungle. And Jonathan Ott is the one who came up with the theory that I find the most plausible, that experimentation with the snuffs for thousands of years before ayahuasca, that they realized the effect of the Banisteris capi of the ayahuasca vine, and that would actually prolong the effect of the snuff. So once they'd made that breakthrough, it wouldn't be that big of a jump to actually brewing the ayahuasca up.
Okay. So is ayahuasca...
But to me, that's...
So is the snuff...
Sorry, go ahead.
Is the snuff still in use on the island, or is that kind of fallen out of favor?
Sorry, yeah, that question didn't come through.
Is the snuff still in use in the Dominican Republic?
No, I think it was pretty much stamped out here. I mean, the Tainos are basically extinct. The Spanish killed millions of them off trying to get them to mine and disease, and the ones that didn't want to work just died. So I would presume snuff use in this island has ceased, but it still continues in many places in South America.
Okay, all right. So your book, Tryptamine Palace, so you were talking about Jeremy Narby was he was an anthropologist, right?
Yeah, and Swiss Canadian.
Yeah.
Very, very, very straight.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was a product of his time, but he was really kind of venturing outside of the norm, with his book.
He was pretty straight even for a product of his time, I would say. That Swissness definitely shines through. I've met Jeremy. He's a great guy. That's one of my favorite books in the psychedelics and the 21st century, for sure. I think The Cosmic Serpent's an awesome book. And, it's kind of that classic story of he was a very scientific, rationalist, atheist, and he spent months with these tribes, and it wasn't until the very last day that, he kept asking the shaman, well, yeah, I understand the plants tell you, but how do you really find out? How do you really find out? How do you piss the shaman off so much that the shaman was like, well, the only way you're going to know is if you sit with us. So Narby agreed to drink ayahuasca on his final night, and the shaman obviously gave him a fine dose, and Narby had this, commonly extraordinary psychedelic experience where he was tripping over these big fluorescent snakes. And in the end, through his book, Narby, our books are kind of similar because we both get completely knocked out of our atheistic, scientific, rationalist boxes, and then we go looking for theories that help us understand our new noetic knowledge. And I think that's the big thing. Some people can have these experiences and just roll with it. But guys like me and Narby, we need to at least try and look for answers. And when I started, I didn't really expect to find any on Tryptamine Palace. I was just trying to understand how I had gone from being a hardcore atheist to a modern mystic in one 30-minute experience. I don't think anything could have surprised me more greatly.
Yeah, that comes through so well in that book.
Yeah, that's where I think the Cosmic Serpent and Tryptamine Palace are quite similar. Out looking for a framework, I think, is probably the best explanation that could help us to understand our experiences. And both of us were surprised the direction that our answers took us. And Jeremy very much concentrated on the biophotonic emissions, the fact that DNA actually emits light, and this idea that there was the DNA that was causing the visions that he would see. And I think I used that as the starting point for my investigation, which really led me into understanding the zero-point field, which is this relatively newly discovered field of energy that penetrates everything in the universe and is now really considered to be the basis of existence, which is a sea of light. And that's where the biophotonic emissions come from. So in my book, in Tryptamine Palace, I have a model that I present that presumes that the brain doesn't create consciousness but receives it, and that consciousness is a universal field that resides in this zero-point field of light, which is basically believed to be the hardest thing in the universe, of like a holographic crystalline nature. Now, this sounds very new agey, but this is actually current scientific cutting-edge stuff. I mean, Alan Aspect's experiments where they teleported electrons, which made big news a few years ago, that's total zero-point field investigations. Basically, the idea is there is no distance in the zero-point field. So if you could put something into the zero-point field, it could re-emerge on the other side of the universe at the same instant. So time and space don't really exist in the zero-point field, which is, as a 5-MeO-DMT user, was a big, all right, I'm on the right track. So that's one of the things I think makes Tryptamine Palace interesting, is that it does present a model. Most psychedelic books don't present much of models. And, I think, to include Nabi and mine's book and with Doors of Perception, I think there's similar books in the sense that we all have got to discover. I mean, I was very lucky. I was the right writer with the right skill set to discover such a powerful new entheogen, quite early on, to the point that no one else had written about it. And as time's gone by, I've realized how fortunate that synchronicity was. And I often feel Tryptamine Palace wrote itself. I was working on a novel at the time, which I'm now just starting back in on. And I had, it was it would seem like a very bad idea to write a book about psychedelics in 2003 when I started. And I didn't think I'd be able to get it published. So I gifted it at Burning Man for 2 years. That was kind of I was very into the idea of being a Burning Man artist in those days. I still am, but that was particularly a peak. And so I think I wrote the first book for Burning Man that was gifted at Burning Man. And the fact that escaped the playa to be published by a worldwide publisher, and it's, the last 15 years 10 years I've been traveling the globe invited to talk about it. It's been quite a remarkable journey. And I always say it's a book that it wanted to get out there. So I was kind of a conduit for that information more than anything.
So what do you think the greatest appeal is around 5-MeO-DMT, and what would you say is the biggest difference between 5-MeO-DMT and DMT itself?
Well, they're two very different compounds, and I think the appeal for 5-methoxy-DMT is the appeal of the unknown, because you can't actually compare it to anything else. I don't even think it should actually be considered a psychedelic. It's almost in a category entirely unique to itself. And I often say it's the only true entheogen. I've pulled back from that statement, because I think that resonant state that I talk about in Tryptamine Palace, this Bose-Einstein condensate of consciousness, I think you can have that on many other compounds. 5-MeO is just the one that's the most guaranteed and was the one that worked for me because I got a pretty hard head. I think the fascination with DMT is easy to understand because it's magical, and it's actually a lot easier one for people to experience. I'm a little bit worried about the hype about 5-methoxy-DMT these days. I think most people don't really understand it. I think there's definitely a dangerous negative side to it that doesn't exist for most other psychedelics. You can have an adverse reaction. I'm kind of glad Michael Pollan had a bad reaction. He's been going on Colbert and everything at the moment. Michael Pollan came out and said 5-methoxy-DMT was the greatest thing ever, and he found God and it was going to make him change the world. Then he could have opened the floodgates to all kinds of craziness. So in some ways, it's interesting. I think the molecule is keeping itself just where it wants to be at the moment, because reading Michael Pollan's book's interesting. I'm reading it at the moment. And it's a very sanitized main version of psychedelics. It's almost like they're trying to clean the freaks out of psychedelics. It's quite funny. And that's what I discuss a lot in my new book, this mainstreaming of psychedelic culture that's been going on the last 15 years.
Yeah.
Which is my new book's The New Psychedelic Revolution. Quick.
Yeah. No, and we'll put a link in on this video for that. So for people who want to check out both of those books, I read Tryptamine Palace a few years ago, and I think I wrote you a message shortly after that. It was that the only book I liked better was the Bible, and and I was just so impressed at the directness between what was explained and how a first-hand account brought that home in an understandable way for me. Because I've had an interest in this stuff since I was a teenager, and I went on all my adventures as a teenager back in the 70s and learned a lot. But that was with all the stuff that was available at that time, mushrooms and LSD and that whole culture that grew out of the late 60s. And so I'd read the Carlos Castaneda books, everything I could get my hands on. I just read Darby's book more recently. I'd written your book years before I read Darby's, although I had owned a copy of it for a while.
Narby.
What's that?
Jeremy Narby.
Narby, yeah, Narby. And so I was fascinated just with the I guess the firsthand nature of your account. I mean, that to me, that was the most impressive part about it, is just I don't know. I felt there was a level of accuracy there that you wouldn't get somewhere else.
Thank you. I think I have a long history of writing for extreme sports, and I think that actually helped me a lot with writing Tryptamine Palace, because I've spent a lot of years going into the mountains and doing things with athletes far, far better than me. So I've always had to learn to write from an almost depreciating, you can't puff yourself up too much when you're in there with the big boys.
Right.
So I think that allowed me a certain way of dealing with the subject that was crucial for making it believable.
Yeah, no, and that made. I was just thinking, like, with that kind of thing, if you embellish a story, you get caught pretty quick. If you're trying to make it into something that it isn't, and you're around people who really know what they're doing, and they read it, they're going to go, "Hey, what is this? Where were you?"
I think my tremendous surprise comes through.
Yes.
And really what motivated the writing in the first place. If that hadn't happened, it would have never got written.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what I guess that's where I picked up on the accuracy part of it, was just that it wasn't there was the surprise there, but it was genuine, and it was described accurately. And then having had experiences, like God experiences myself, you could I could sniff it out. This is the real deal. This isn't somebody just making a Hallmark card for us.
That's been one of the most rewarding things about it, is when I wrote it, I had no idea what other people would think, when my experience was like anybody else's. This was just my experience, and the fact that it's resonated with so many people and has become, when I get the emails from people who are having a hard time in their reintegrations, and they're like, we're so glad we got your book. We wake up in the middle of the night, we read a few pages, I'm like, spot on. That was how I wrote it. To be gifted at Burning Man was literally if you had wandered into some dome and somebody had offered you 5-MeO-DMT and you'd taken it blindly, like I had, you would have some kind of a reference, and it wasn't necessarily like it was presented as these are all the facts, but there was this is what happened to me, and I think in the book I call it a life raft,
Yeah.
That's one of the things I really like about Tryptamine Palace. I can still read it.
So with your tell us about your new book.
Well, the new book's funny too, because at first I never thought I'd write a book about psychedelics, and then 5-methoxy-DMT came along. So then I never thought I'd write another book about psychedelics. And then after a decade of kind of having this front row seat in psychedelic culture, as I have, and I started to look at the various articles and things that I had written over the previous decade, I realized I did have another book in me about psychedelics, more one about contemporary psychedelic culture. So the new book's quite different, and it really focuses in on different facets of psychedelic culture. There's a 200-page history of psychedelic art. It's set in 4 parts, so there's 4 different sort of tones to it, a lot of essays. But my editors did a very good job of us pulling it all together, so it reads as a single piece, I think. I was a little bit resistant to that originally. My editors in a tradition are very good at convincing me eventually, and they're generally correct. And that's one of the, to me, looking at the book, one of the big differences I see is, this is my second time working with a major publisher and working with editors, and how much more I've learned about that process. So I think it comes through in the book, and the book's very easy to read, I think. That's what everybody keeps saying. I really believe that's one of the hallmarks of good writing, is to be able to translate complicated ideas simply. And I think in the traditions, my publisher does a great job with that with their books.
Who's your publisher?
Inner Traditions, who also publish Irvin Laszlo's work and Rupert Sheldrake's work and a lot of the new physics stuff that I really liked, which is when I first sent them a copy of the book just to get rejected. And I didn't actually know that they had published DMT, the spirit molecule.
Oh.
And since then, they've also published James Fadiman's Psychedelic Guide and a few really good, I think, to the top books in the psychedelic field of recent years. And
they're based out of where?
Rochester, New York.
Oh, okay. All right. Was there any other publishers? Are you from the UK originally?
New Zealand.
New Zealand, okay. New Zealand. Was there any publishers in New Zealand or Australia that were interested in your work?
I didn't try, to be honest. I sent 2 copies. Basically, after the Burning Man copies went around for a couple of years, I was convinced by some of the psychedelic elders that it was good enough for mainstream consumption or publication. And I was like, I took that as a great honor that people liked it that much. Worked with an editor who's done a lot of work with the Entheogen Review in Erowid, who's a great editor, and he helped me to get it to a self-publication stage, which we were about to do, and I've always had this thing about getting rejected by publishers. So I was like, oh, it's toughen up. So I sent 2 copies into 2 publishers to get used to getting rejected, which my editor at the time thought was a terrible idea. And to everybody's amazement, Inner Traditions accepted it, which is pretty much unheard of.
Did you get invited to speak in Australia or New Zealand at all about this?
Yeah, last December I spoke in Entheogenesis in Australia, which was a great conference. I enjoyed it a lot.
In Sydney?
But that was my first Down Under appearance.
In Sydney?
No, it was out in the bush outside of Melbourne.
Oh, okay.
In a retreat centre. It was a great small conference, very educated audience. They got a great list of speakers together. Entheogenesis.
Okay, all right. We'll look that up. So, in your upcoming speaking engagements, do you have any coming up?
Yeah, I've been invited to UCLA in Los Angeles, June 23rd. I'm appearing on 2 panels in something called the Los Angeles Psychedelic Society Symposium, Lapsed into Consciousness. I'm doing a 5-methoxy-DMT panel, and I'm also on another more wide panel with David J. Brown and Daniel Pinchbeck and a few other characters. So it should be fun. And then I have agreed to go to the World Bufo Alvarius Conference, the WBAC, in Mexico City last week of July, which is the first ever conference on the toad. And there's been a lot of controversial practices involving the toad of late, and this conference is slightly controversial, but I figured if they wanted to invite me down there to stir up some trouble, I might as well go.
Wow. So tell us about the controversy around the toad.
Well, there's lots of controversy. A lot of it falls back on the old natural versus synthetic argument, which I personally find redundant, so I don't tend to play along with that game.
Yeah.
There's also, in my opinion, most people aren't looking for practitioners. They're just looking for 5-MeO-DMT. And they have to go through a practitioner to get it. There's no other way. I think the easiest way for us to get around the current situation is the publication of simple extraction recipes for 5-MeO-DMT from plants. I know my good friend Julian Palmer in Australia is working away on this. Sorry, Julian, if you didn't want to mention them. So I think in the next, if we could see 5-methoxy-DMT as easily available as DMT from extracts, we would almost immediately eradicate the problems with practitioners. Now, I know most practitioners are going to disagree with me violently on that, and they're going to say that they are a part of the process. I received my 5-MeO-DMT legally from a research chemical company in a brown envelope in the mail in 2002 or whenever it was. I just think all you really need is someone to sit there to make sure that you don't vomit, knows how to put you in the recovery position. And if you want to go down that particular alleyway, you don't need, a practitioner. But I do think you should be very aware of what it is that you're working with.
Right.
And, I find most of the practitioners, in the 10 years since Trypta, I was discussing the ego and entheogens, which has kind of been my main interest since the publication of Tryptamine Palace, and especially in trying to integrate Eckhart Tolle's ideas into a more psychedelic perspective. And I think we've easily learned from the blowouts of the psychedelic leaders of the 60s that psychedelics will rip the ego apart, but then in the same way that muscle, when it's torn apart, builds back stronger afterwards, the ego can actually reform stronger and stronger and stronger after each psychedelic experience, and can actually form around the psychedelic experience itself, which is, I think, what we saw with Tim Leary and Ken Kesey and a lot of these characters. You know, I think Kesey realized it, which is why he disappeared onto the farm for years, just to try and salvage his own soul in some ways. And I think we're seeing this a lot with these entheogenic practitioners, especially the ones that work with substances like 5-methoxy-DMT that are really on the high end. Like, personally, I think if 5-methoxy-DMT has really worked for you, you know, if you do it once a year, once every 2 years, that's plenty. Just sets you back on track. It's the idea of doing it over and over and over again until I think you calcify to the experience. And especially these practitioners who have the habit of taking the tail end of the pipe. So they'll give the participant and then they'll tail end everyone, and they believe that they're somehow entering in your experience and guiding you. With a compound like 5-methoxy-DMT, I think that's just the ultimate ego trip. You know, all you're there to do as a practitioner is keep the person safe and give them a neutral container. And when I hear about practitioners, you know, using electric shock devices, pouring water down people's throats, lying on top of them, hissing in them like snakes. Like, I get letters from all kinds of people who've had bizarre experiences, and they're trying to help me understand what happened to them. And I can tell within a few lines who the practitioner was from their particular style, you know. And I think these guys, this is one of the arguments with the toad versus natural, this idea that toad is somehow superior to synthetic. Well, if 5-MeO-DMT delivers the ultimate experience of the transpersonal experience of allness with everything, unity, the mystical experience, you can't go past that. You know, there's not 5-MeO. There's, as they say in Spinal Tap, it doesn't go to 11. You know. So the idea that there are compounds in toad that make it superior to 5-MeO-DMT, I find a novel argument, and I could agree if we ever discover that those compounds have beneficial side effects. What's interesting is toad does still contain a reasonable amount of bufatonin, which is quite toxic and can induce heart attacks as a known cardiac agent. So actually, from a strict safety perspective, synthetic measured correctly is far safer than toad eyeballed, because you don't really ever know how much 5-methoxy-DMT is in the venom, and there's a big variety, that it can vary up and down considerably. So at the best, the practitioners having a guess with toad. And that's not an argument I particularly want to get drawn into, but from that, I stand by that from a safety perspective. And I think the argument that these toad venom is superior very much has to do with the practitioners being able to continue doing what they're doing. And I notice there are lots of toad practitioners jumping up all over the United States at the moment, and I'm really curious where they're all getting their toad venom from. There's obviously some kind of a channel or network that one of the major toad shamans is responsible for. So I tend to get these guys try and draw me into their discussions as if I agree with some of the things they say, and when I tend to step in to defend myself, the result's gotten quite personal.
Yeah, that's too bad. It's to be expected, I would imagine, especially with something so powerful like that.
Well, it's one of the reasons I've chosen never to be a practitioner, other than to my friends or to my immediate circles.
Yeah.
Because I don't want the responsibility of cavalierly rolling into somebody's town and delivering something as power. If you really, really, really believe 5-MeO-DMT is as powerful as I do, and you understand, one of the things, Michael Pollan had this very, very negative reaction to Toad, and I watched a number of these practitioners get asked about it on the internet, and their responses I thought were very weak. Or actually, most of them were like, oh, he didn't do enough, or if he did it with me, it would have been okay, kind of thing. And none of them really seemed to have any empathy for the negative experience at all. Whereas a negative hell experience is just as real as the positive heaven experience. And if you've been to heaven and can imagine the depths of hell, then you have to have empathy and respect for the substance that you're dealing with. And if one of your people happens to go to the hell realm, I feel you have a responsibility to do everything you can to be with those people,
right,
or to help them,
right.
And all the years that I've given 5-methoxy-DMT to people, I've only ever seen one real hell trip, and it was at an occasion where I was convinced to give it to somebody I didn't want to give it to.
Wow.
And at the time, I was like, oh, who are you to decide who gets it or who doesn't get it? This guy was in the right place at the right time, and I'd given it to a couple of other people. And I just met him a couple of days earlier, and my early reaction was that he was young and immature, and he was there for all the wrong reasons. That was just my immediate reaction.
Right.
And then I was convinced to give it to him, and I watched him get dragged through hell. And it was tough for me to watch.
Yeah.
And then what was interesting was the people that had just gone to heaven previously, they could not relate to him at all. It's like they were trying to have a conversation in two different languages. And my one friend, she was trying to convince him to go again, and I was like, he's never going to go again.
Yeah.
This idea that Michael Pollan can be convinced to try it again with somebody else or more. Michael Pollan will never approach 5-methoxy-DMT again.
Yeah.
Yeah, guaranteed.
Right.
And that was his lesson. There's a remarkable book that a gentleman called Robert Augustus Masters wrote called Darkness Shining Wild. It's entirely about the negative aspect of the 5-MeO-DMT trip and his 10-year battle with it. It's a quite terrifying book.
What's the name of that book again?
Darkness Shining Wild. I mentioned it in the appendix to Tryptamine Palace, where because Tryptamine Palace was such a positive book about 5-methoxy-DMT,
right,
and my experience, I felt it was my responsibility to point out the potential negative sides of it. So the very last chapter of Tryptamine Palace is the appendix Heaven and Hell, and I go into Robert Augustus Masters' experience quite a lot, because his was the best documented one of the time. He interestingly lives in Ashland, Oregon, which is a bit of a 5-methoxy-DMT hot spot with a couple of the well-known 5-MeO-DMT guys up there. And if he gets approached about it, like if you see him in the co-op or something and try to talk to him about it, he just turns and runs. He does not want to discuss that part of his life at all.
Yeah.
He's also the guy who just wrote he also just came out with a very interesting book about spiritual bypassing that's been getting a bit of attention. It came out the last 6 months.
Oh, interesting. That's where Martin Ball's at too, right?
Martin is in Ashland. Yes.
Yeah, in Ashland. Okay. Yeah, that's not too far from where I live. I'm south. I'm down by San Francisco, but same side of the world.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. Mexico City. Have you ever been there before?
Oh yeah, I've spent a lot of time in Mexico.
Okay. And that conference is just kind of focusing on the toad.
Entirely.
Okay. And that's where the purists, is it kind of like an enclave of purists around the toad argument?
Purist I don't think is the right word.
Okay.
What I'm a little bit disappointed the way the psychedelic community gets pulled back into the New Age community so often. I think there are various nodes where we have this potential to break into a different kind of modality, and we keep getting pulled back into this New Aginess.
Yeah.
Which is understandable. I think, ironically, they're going to look back at the 90s as being one of the golden eras of psychonauts, because there was such a small and really educated population of true psychonauts. The research chemical companies were out there. They were just discovering all these things for the first time. So the first wave was very, very much tried to keep the new agey character of it out of it.
Right.
Admittedly, Terence McKenna kind of strays a foot in both camps, but he's also was much more of a anarchistic, techno, William Gibson hacker kind of guy as well, which is what the early Burning Man was very much like, and I feel often more akin to the hacker, information anarchist William Gibson kind of view of the future than I certainly do any Ram Dass new agey perspective. So what's happened with 5-methoxy-DMT is initially it was available by research chemical companies. So its early explorers were all very informed psychonauts, or at least interested enough, like I was, to have a clue what we were getting ourselves into. Mm-hmm. I'd been looking for DMT. I'd been looking for DMT for years, which is how I stumbled across 5-methoxy-DMT.
Right.
He smoked 5-MeO before I ever smoked DMT. But then once now that the chemical companies, research chemical companies disappeared, 5-MeO became very difficult to obtain, and now the most readable supply of it seems to be the toad venom coming out of Mexico. So once again, it kind of gets back to this practitioner thing. If you want a chance to try it, and one of these guys comes through your city, then you're probably going to sign up. And that's going on all over the place, and they're spreading out, and they've got more and more disciples, for lack of a better word. I don't know where these guys are all getting their toad from. I presume there's this pipeline. And so if you're interested in this day and age, that's probably where you're going to find it. And I've actually come to the opinion that now the practitioner that you find is some kind of karmic story all of your own, because they're all so different. They've all got interesting stories attached to them. I got a couple of friends who are practitioners, and they're always trying to convince me to sit through one of their ceremonies, and I'm like, no way. For one, it's way too private and personal for me. If I smoke, I just smoke alone now.
Yeah.
And have for a long time, because as the ego tries to reestablish itself after you've been in the transpersonal state, the easiest way for the ego to reform is via shared experience. So if there are other people in the room who you're friends or lovers or whatever, you immediately latch onto that lifeline of your shared experience, and often it can be quite gushy, for lack of a better word. When I smoke it alone, I lie in the in-between state between the transpersonal and ego consciousness, kind of more with one foot in each world for longer and longer. And that's actually the zone that kind of fascinates me these days, is this in-between zone, and that can only be done if you're alone. If there's anybody else in the room, it's immediately...
It would seem you would get more benefit from that process too.
Certainly in my model. It's just such a personal thing, and you hear about these big groups of strangers smoking it together, and it works for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And for a few people it doesn't. But I think that's part of the problem, is that we're 15 years on now, 20 years on from what in some ways was like a golden age of psychonauts. It's probably earned it in the early 2000s, about when I discovered 5-MeO. And now we have the conferences and the internet spreading the information, and it's becoming quite a fashionable thing. As Alison Gray said to me, she said, psychedelic culture is the hippest thing out there. Everybody wants a piece of it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And you're seeing the Michael Pollan's of the world writing another New York Times bestseller. Like, I'm enjoying Pollan's book, and I think there's some really, I agree with some of his conclusions. Oh, you said something earlier about doing psychedelics as a teenager. I agree with Michael Pollan that I think they're more effective the older you get. As your consciousness develops, psychedelics' ability to work with them develops and becomes more interesting. I think as a teenager, you have a certain kind of psychedelic experience that's very much rooted in your teenageness. You know, I have so many friends who did acid at high school and then didn't touch it for years. And it's usually the MDMA that pulls them back in because they're out partying and they're at Burning Man and stuff, and they've gotten into the MDMA enough to be out partying. And that, you know, MDMA is a very social drug. You don't feel uncomfortable on MDMA generally.
Yeah.
They see their friends on acid having a really good time at Burning Man, so finally they get the courage, and now they're in the right set and setting. They got someone to tell them it's best to do it for breakfast, not at midnight when you're drunk. You know, I've actually been quoted in the New York Times saying that LSD is best taken for breakfast. I'm very proud of that. And it's a totally different experience. You know, these 30-somethings, 40-somethings come to me and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe how different it was, and rah, rah, rah. And I'm like, well, look how different your mind is, your consciousness, to when you were 15. You know, that's the difference.
Yeah, well, yeah, and for me too, like I was in those early days, there was a party aspect of it that I'm not interested in now. I'm not interested in it I'm not interested as approaching it from a party aspect in any respect. I mean, the idea of doing something like that with alcohol in the mix, just, I mean, for me personally, just it's repulsive. It's like, you know, you're at mixed. I don't know. It defeats the idea for me. It's like, I
agree with you that I agree with you that they can be used in a sacred manner, but I also think they can be used correctly in a profane manner as well.
Yeah.
And that they're often a far better alternative than the legal ones.
Yeah.
I'm one of the main voices you'll hear speaking out against alcohol and especially cocaine in my community. I think that as a community, we should be able to decipher what's good and what's bad. In my new book, there's a whole essay on this about entheogens and the ego, and I come up with the scale, the Oroc entheogen scale, and I say, okay, everything has a random value attributed to it to make a graph, right? So I'm going to use for my scale the effect on the ego, and I'm going to put the drugs on the top of the scale that most dissipate the ego, and I'm going to put the drugs on the bottom that most reinforce the ego. So when you draw it up as a list, it goes from the tryptamines on down. It goes 5-MeO-DMT, DMT, acid, and down, and then you got weed and MDMA and things kind of in the middle. You drop into the hazy area of the opiates, and then you get down to the really dirty drugs at the bottom, methamphetamine and cocaine and alcohol.
Right.
You know, cocaine's the ultimate me drug. A whole bunch of people stand around going me with their back to the band, not listening to anybody. And alcohol, you think your opinion's so important you're getting a fight over it, right? Now the interesting thing is that if you look at the same scale, there's a direct relationship to toxicity. So the more a drug dissipates the ego, the least toxic it is. The top two, 5-MeO and DMT, are actually presumed to be endogenous. And then as you go down and down, they just get more and more toxic, with cocaine and alcohol being the most toxic at the bottom. So I think our bodies really tell us what is good for us. So you've seen us off on this whole other trip for these drugs that it needs for us to actually get to work. And Michael Pollan actually states it brilliantly in his new book. He talks about having this jar of mushrooms that somebody gave him, and he does 2 mushroom trips, bizarrely. One really good one, and then one where him and his wife kind of get freaked out a bit. So they leave the jar of mushrooms in the pantry. And then he says, then a new drug came along that made it much easier to weave into the fabric of Manhattan social society, cocaine. And the next time we went through the pantry, we threw the jar out. So in one paragraph, he actually describes perfectly, without even realizing it, I think, the demise of psychedelic culture. And it's very interesting that, you know, I always say the psychedelic revolution of the 60s, few revolutions have succeeded so quickly and then been abandoned with the same haste. Really, it was only 5 or 6 years long at its peak, and it was abandoned almost utterly in the 80s when psychedelic use was considered to be very fringe. And of course, what we got in the 80s was a wave of cocaine.
Right.
Cheaper, readily available cocaine for the masses, which keeps them all working and going to work. It's a much more socially productive drug.
Is Michael Pollan familiar with your work at all, or do you know?
He doesn't list it. You know, he seems very enamored with the elder psychedelic leaders, which is understandable. And he seems very enamored with the ones that took him under his wing, which is also understandable. He doesn't make any mention of any authors younger than himself, and he's like 15 years older than me. But I would be surprised if no one's mentioned Tryptamine Palace to him, if no one has not mentioned Tryptamine Palace to him by now, considering his very public Toad experience. And my new book makes it interesting. Reading my book and his book side by side is quite interesting because they're almost companion pieces. He focuses in on the research, which I kind of avoided, and I focus in more on psychedelic culture. And I'm coming from the top end and he's coming from the bottom end, but together there, it's quite an interesting mix. I do think he's been fed a very sanitized version of psychedelic culture.
Yeah, I find it curious that a writer such as him, I'm familiar with his work from the farming aspect. That was my introduction to Michael, and I actually met him and out our way at it was a food fair thing celebrating fermented foods. It was a fermented food fair there, and I just met him real briefly, and but I had read some of his books and stuff, and I just find it interesting that when someone tackles a subject like that, they don't peruse to see what's out there. And well, maybe he did. He just, for whatever reason, decided not to make it part of his background.
When he talks about the toad, he says there was nothing out there other than the essay by Wade Davis, which is bizarre because my book was out there at the time.
Yeah, then you got Arrowhead and all that stuff. I mean, that's like a, I
mean, I don't know. I've been hearing about his book ever since he's been writing it, so I know he hasn't been in the scene that long.
Yeah.
Apparently like I said, he doesn't mention any younger writers. And it's interesting that our new books explore a lot of the same themes. I'm glad mine came out first.
Well, I think
a lot of the themes he explores did appear in various essays I wrote online over the last few years. But he doesn't make any mention of having read any of my work, so I have no reason to think so.
Okay. So do you have any speaking engagements coming up in Europe?
No, not this year. I'll probably make it back to Europe next year.
Okay. How about the UK? Have you been in the UK to speak?
I was supposed to go to an event in Turingham last year, like kind of a closed session thing. And I tried to fly there through Canada, and they wouldn't let me into Canada to change planes because of some bungee jumping arrest from like 1993. So I've been banned from Canada for extreme sports.
Oh my
And
gosh.
that messed up my entire program to make it to Turingham. This September, I think it's the last week of September, I'm going to be in New York City, and they're releasing the book that came from the Turingham talks. And there's a panel with me and Alex Gray and Daniel Pinchbeck, I think, and a few of us, which will be my first New York City appearance, which I think September 27th.
Okay.
So that should be interesting. But no, mostly in Europe. I've been in, I talk at the Psytrance festivals a bit. So I've been to Boom twice, Lost Theory in Croatia. I've been to Ozora in Hungary twice, Sci-Fi in Holland. I would have liked to have gone to the Beyond Psychedelics event in the Czech Republic this summer, but I just I've been traveling a lot. I kind of need a break.
Yeah, yeah. So the next one is June 23rd in LA.
Yeah.
Okay. Dang.
That's called LAPS, LAPSS.
Okay.
So if they go to laps.org, we'll pull that up.
Okay, good. All right. Well, this has been wonderful. I'm so glad we did this. I could go for another 2 hours.
It's been fun.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean I've got a lot to learn, but it's been just fascinating reading your work. I kind of wish that I had read it more recently because it's been a couple of years since I've read Tryptamine Palace. Now I want to get your new book, and
the new Psychedelic Revolution.
What's that?
Yeah, it's called the new Psychedelic Revolution.
Yeah,
Genesis of the Visionary Age.
So James, if someone wants to get that book and not use Amazon, what do you suggest?
Well, I know that the major booksellers sometimes carry it, like Barnes and Nobles and Borders, if they still exist. I always just encourage people to go to their favorite local bookstore and order it, because usually if they order it, the bookstore will order a couple more as well.
Okay.
And Inner Traditions is in every bookstore in America pretty much. So
yeah,
it's an easy book to find.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me, and have a great travel to LA. I wish I could go down there and meet you in person. I don't know if that's going to be possible for me with my schedule, but have a great time there, and thank you for joining me. And I hope we can do a follow up at some point. That would be fascinating, maybe with a better connection, or maybe even
when I'm back stateside.
Yeah. Okay, and I want to thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.